sector. We'll talk about regulatory issues and some of the growing pains, particularly in Saudi Arabia, but I think talking to my colleagues elsewhere as well in terms of aligning the different regulators so that they're coherent and not conflicting with each other. And then we'll talk about governance, which is also a work in progress throughout the Gulf and has largely just copied and pasted Western ideas of fiduciary accountability and independent judgment and diversity of opinions and the concept that you want to have the right kind of conflict on the board. And how is that working, and how we still have some crises that relate to the old regime where there's a strong patriarchy and not a lot of divided governance on the board, so we'll talk about that as well. But before we get into some of these substantive matters, we'll introduce our panel. We have Eric, who'll say a few words about his special expertise and background.
Good afternoon, Eric Staal from Mundi. I'm Vice President of Global Markets, and I guess what I bring to the panel today is perhaps a perspective about some of the work and interactions we have with general counsel around the world, representing multinational companies and interested in investing here in this part of the world, as well as those that are based here but doing business outbound with the US, Europe, and investing in other parts of the world.
Yeah, hi, I'm Charles Slovak. You heard my colleague Abdulla moderate the first panel. Both of us are from Afridi and Angel. We are the Lex Mundi member firm for the UAE. Speaking personally for myself, I have been living in the UAE since the 4th of January 1986, so I just finished 39 years. And I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm not going to talk anymore in Arabic, but just so you all know, I use it in my work all the time. It's a fascinating, beautiful language.
And Malcolm Dickinson from our Oman Lex Mundi member firm, Saslo.
Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the hosts for inviting us onto the panel. I'm Malcolm Dickinson. I'm the CEO of Saslo. We're the member firm of Lex Mundi in Oman. I've been CEO for over 4 years now in Muscat. And before that, I was managing partner of a law firm in the UK for over 10 years. And even before that, was an M&A lawyer for probably more than 30 years. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the panel.
And Salman from our host firm here in Doha.
Locally, and the need to be more effective as jurisdictions compete for investment capital and compete for opportunities. What that means is that from the perspective of investors and multinational companies trying to operate in different places is trying to join up the dots. And that's where the Equisphere capability comes in. We launched it actually right amidst the pandemic in June 2020. And the purpose was to help companies navigate regulatory change across jurisdictions in ways that would allow them to stay ahead of their competitors, to comply with all the requirements that they have. So what we're able to do with Equisphere is to have a team of project management professionals who understand legal risk, understand corporate strategies, and then work with the general counsels or the legal directors to put together the right resources in the different places so that they have the right guidance to give to the company about its operations, about its decisions. So really taking a project management professional to be an extension of the GC or the in-house legal department, and to work as part of the team in the legal department and then as an extension of our member firms. So typically a client would come into the Gulf region if they're looking at different jurisdictions. They would perhaps work with the lead counsel, such as Malcolm or Charles or Chris or Michael from Sultan Al-Abdulla Partners. We will be an extension of that team, helping them to join the dots of the expertise and to coordinate the local council so things don't get lost in the process. Information flows in a timely fashion, and decisions can get made when they need to get made as things are changing. I hope that gives a succinct overview of it, but we can talk to you further about the mechanics of how we do that with project management skills and methodologies. But for now, let that suffice.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Eric. Now, in terms of legal reform, Saudi Arabia, as I say, has been very creative and very progressive in changing its paradigm. We have this vibe shift, and there's a big emphasis on reallocating sovereign wealth from a 90-10 distribution, 90% in-country, 10% offshore in 2015, to 50-50 by 2030. And that means attracting foreign investment, investing funds overseas, diversifying the economy. So we have a big initiative by the Sovereign Wealth Fund to kickstart activity in industry and agriculture in a wide range of different activities. And we see that there's a shift in the regulatory regime, which has been very restrictive and very protectionist against foreign investment. And now there's the prospect that that could change radically. We have an announcement that hasn't really been fleshed out that in the first quarter of this year, we're going to eliminate the licensing by the Ministry of Investment and allow foreign investors national treatment and equality in registering companies directly with the Ministry of Commerce. Will this mean that all of the negative lists and restricted activities like trading will be opened up to the foreign investor? That's quite possible. So that's one change that could significantly improve the attractiveness of Saudi Arabia to international investors. Another change where all of the other countries here are way ahead of Saudi Arabia is in codifying their civil law and their contracts. Saudi Arabia only recently has implemented a civil transactions law that's similar to the ones that you find in all the other countries represented here. But before that, everything relied directly on the Sharia without any codification. And so there's going to be some controversy about whether the judges who are trained in Sharia accept that they now look to the code and not to the traditional jurisprudence to find. And so there's some differences that arise in the new civil transactions law, including regarding damages for breach of contract or for civil tort, where consequential damages are allowed. Well, that has not been the rule before. So will there be pushback? That's kind of an interesting question. We have a new bankruptcy law. There's a codification from the traditional Sharia. We have various areas that are now being subject to reform. Enforcement law. You can now enforce judgments much more quickly than in most other countries in the world. So those are some of the trends that we see in new legislation in Saudi Arabia. Charles, could I turn to you to let us know what are the new things to see and expect in the UAE?
Sure. Thanks very much, Chris. I'll give you a quick overview. The UAE, I think, maybe along with Qatar and Bahrain, only really goes back to 1971, and before that it was not, an independent country member of the United Nations and all that. But when the country was formed, when the 7 Emirates got together and decided to form a single federal government, and all of the legislative progress of the UAE then is only really the product of the past 54 years, one person's lifetime. The legislative the UAE for really since the 70s has been one where the legal system has been framed and formed by legislation. There's an industries law, a companies law, civil code from 1985, way before the kingdom, commercial code, and a bunch of other, pretty much the whole gamut of economic activity is now regulated by statute and by regulations promulgated pursuant to those statutes. What has happened in the past 7 or 8 years, it began before COVID and has really picked up afterwards, is that it's not been quite a paradigm shift like in the kingdom, but there has been a real acceleration in legislative change. During one recent year, I think it was 2022, the UAE enacted 42 different statutes. They either were amending old statutes or using new ones. A new labor law, a new bankruptcy law, there's a new companies law, and many, many other fundamental statutes got sort of an upgrade, a refresher. And along with this change of pace, there has been I don't know if you want to call it a centralization of the legislative process or regulatory process, or maybe one of streamlining the decision-making process. But more and more statutes now are being promulgated as decree laws. Marasum bi Qanun, right? Marasim bi Qanun. And that's a special, I think you've got it throughout the Gulf. Marasum bi Qanun is a law that is promulgated by the ruler directly without going through Parliament, or in the case of the UAE, the Federal National Council. And so that's an accelerated process of making a law binding. And the Constitution has been amended, so you don't have to send it back to the Federal National Council after promulgation anymore. What that means is that when a law is promulgated by, remember the UAE is 7 emirates, and the old rule was you needed to have the Federal National Council ratify the law, and the law had to be approved by each of the 7 members of the Supreme Council, the 7 rulers. Now basically the President can do it, which means Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, and the President of the UAE. In practice, what it means is that if Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed and Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, the ruler of Dubai, if they agree, then the matter is promulgated as a decree law. And moreover, these new laws are providing for the promulgation of regulations by cabinet resolution. So again, the whole process of not the FNC anymore and the 7 rulers, but 2 of the rulers can agree on a statute, and then tweaks can be done. The regulations in some instances are quite substantial. Those can be done by cabinet resolution, and the cabinet again is dominated by the ruling families of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So I'm not really sure how the other emirates feel about all of this. So far, it's gone okay, but the decision-making process is being centralized quite dramatically. It's very, very different from where it was 10, 15 years ago. And that's making the pace of change. In other countries in the Gulf, you see that things get slowed down by Parliament, right? In Kuwait, how long does it take to pass a law in Kuwait? Decades? In the UAE, it should take longer because there are 7 rulers to get on board, but in fact, it takes almost no time at all. So it's a very nimble process for enacting legislation. It's working okay so far, and it's really, as a lawyer, it's hard to follow something. So much change is happening at such a very, very fast pace that we're always reading the gazettes every month and trying to see what's happening next. It's a challenging environment, but I guess that's what you hope for when you're a lawyer. But that's the UAE. There's more to say, but I think that's a snapshot.
Well, a changing world requires a nimble government to respond. It sounds like the UAE is rising to the occasion. Malcolm, how about in Oman? What are you seeing, and what are the trends, and what are the specific reforms that are relevant to the international business community?
Thank you, Chris. I think if I just maybe take one point, we talked about, I think, 3 US colleagues on my right talking about the vibe shift. We're Canadian, this is stuff. But I think as an Englishman, the word vibe doesn't sit too well for me. And also, I think it highlights the difference perhaps between some of the GCC countries and Oman, whereas I think in Oman there is a pace of a gradual change rather than a paradigm shift. So the country is moving gradually. Sometimes that's not quick enough, but just as a comment, I think it's slightly different. I think before I can answer the question, I think it's worth just looking back at where Amman's come from. And like UAE, the country's modernization renaissance really only started when the late Sultan took power in 1970. And I think for the first probably 10, 15 years, the focus is on legislation which is really linked probably to the energy sector to produce much needed foreign revenue at the time. And I think the first really major piece of legislation for the country was in 1996, which was the Amman's Basic Statute of State, which set out the structure of governance, the rights of individuals, and the founding principles of the state. And I think that's the bedrock of Amman's changes. And it was a hybrid model, recognizing Islamic Sharia law, but also civil and commercial codes. And so I think that contributed, as I say, to political stability in Amman, and also the fact that we are moving at a gradual pace rather than a major shift. And also I think one point which we haven't talked about, but for me, is the importance of the judiciary. And it's not only important for the rule of law in the country, I think it's important for foreign investors to have confidence that if there is a problem in that country where they're investing, there is a strong and independent judiciary. And I think that is the case in Amman, and we have a typical three-tier system of courts, primary, appeal, and supreme, and an independent judiciary. And also that judiciary, there is an administrative court, and all institutions of state are subject to challenge. So I think it's quite important to understand that. And then just picking up on the legislation, we had a purple patch around 2019, 2020, where most of the legislation that we've mentioned already, commercial, corporate, foreign investment laws, bankruptcy law, it was a very busy period, and legislation is passed through royal decrees and then followed up quite often by regulations. Sometimes there's quite a major gap between the decree and the regulations, which causes some uncertainty, and that is causing, at the moment, some uncertainty for us. So I think very similar in some aspects to other countries, but I'd say the pace of change in Amman is perhaps slightly slow.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Now, how about from Ribal and Salman, what is the pace of change, and is there a vibe shift going on in Qatar, and what do we see in terms of the trends in legislation and reforms?
Thank you, Chris. So, as Malcolm said, I think in Qatar, as with Oman, the process of change has evolved. It's an evolutionary process as opposed to a paradigm shift that you talked about in the context of Saudi. So I'll talk about the last 18 years from the time when I moved to Qatar, what I've seen, particularly with reference to ease of doing business. I think the regulatory framework, the legal and regulatory framework has indeed evolved. For instance, the negative list shrunk quite substantially in terms of the number of industries and sectors in which foreign investment is permitted at 100% ownership of capital. So that has changed quite substantially. It's practically possible now to ask for an exemption to the majority Qatari participation rule in almost every field of business. There are still a few items on the negative list, but other than those few, like banking and so on, or insurance, there is absolutely no other area where you cannot ask for that permission. So in the past, what we would have to do as lawyers, advising clients and assisting clients in setting up in Qatar, is to build provisions in the constitutive documents, such as the Articles of Association, Memorandum, and in parallel agreements like consulting agreements and loan agreements and so on, mechanisms whereby the ownership of the capital, 51%, would not prevent the foreign shareholder or the foreign investor from really owning all of the economic interest, or nearly all of it. So we would build devices in the constitutive framework of the corporate entity that we would set up for them. Through these arrangements and devices, we would build in the ability of the foreign shareholder to control the business, to run the business, exercise decision-making power, and so on. But of late, the first thing we tell our clients who are looking to set up in Qatar is that it is possible for you to apply to the ministry, and very likely, given the activities that you wish to undertake in Qatar, you will be permitted, quite likely, to set up a fully 100% owned company in the mainland. Then there are special economic zones where, in any event, there is no compulsion to have a Qatari partner. So that too is the opening up of the economy and the regulatory landscape to foreign investment that has changed over the last 18 years quite substantially. Some of the other changes that I've witnessed in the last 2 decades or so is the modernization of the services that are provided to businesses, the banking, the AML framework, for example. Electronic transactions have been recognized and regulated. So you're able to sign binding instruments electronically. That was not possible. Those instruments that you would sort of agree via email or internet, it was not conclusively the case that they would be enforced in court in the case of a dispute. But now that has been regulated formally by a 2010 law, electronic. Then there's the e-commerce framework. So all of these modernizations, the opening up of the economy to foreign investment, the setting up of economic zones such as the Qatar Financial Center, the QFZ, Qatar Free Zone Authority, the Qatar Science and Technology Park. All of this has attracted a lot of business interest in Qatar, to the extent that while traditionally the UAE is the place where people would set up their corporate headquarters, from where to operate their businesses in various parts of the GCC, there have been inquiries, and lots of them, to us for businesses looking to register their headquarters in Qatar. So these are the things I think that have had very substantial success in Qatar. And on top of that, along with that, as Malcolm mentioned, it's very important to understand, if people set up businesses, would they be able to utilize effective dispute resolution services in the country? Would there be speedy justice? So you can open up the business sector, you can open up the economy to foreign businesses, but if you do not provide an effective and efficient business dispute resolution process, then there would still be not enough interest in setting up your headquarters here. And in that way, what Qatar has done, I've seen over the past several years, is that they've not only set up the Qatar International Court, which was originally a court in the QFC, but now it is a somewhat wider institution, the QIC-DRC. It has also enacted a new arbitration law that enables businesses to have a framework within which their disputes can be resolved if they opt for arbitration. So arbitration has sort of evolved over the years since I've come to Qatar.
Let me give Ribal a chance. Now, this sounds like a very compelling narrative for foreign investors. Has it been working? In what sectors? And should Charles be scared?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. So, technically speaking, in Qatar, so we have the mainland Qatar, And we have some sort of special economic zones, such as the Qatar Free Zone Authority. We have the Qatar Financial Center. We have the Qatar Science and Technology Park, as well as the Media City. So many of global businesses are looking to set up in Qatar if they are carrying out activities on the ground in Qatar. So there are two models that we are usually approached to advise on. We are approached to advise on carrying out activities on a cross-border basis, remotely, which unlikely to require the entity to set up in Qatar, so long it's strictly online. And the other module is to be on the ground in Qatar, generating revenue in Qatar, having employees or personnel on the ground in Qatar. So mainly we have these jurisdictions. In the mainland, although it is developing to be an attractive jurisdiction for foreigners or foreign entities, however, there is still the exemption from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry to be obtained in order to own 100% of the capital of the company. Although, as was Salman mentioning earlier, is that you can still create a structure where you hold 49% of the capital and the Qatari shareholder will hold 51%, but rather you can also have 99% of the economic interests, which is also a bit attractive. But now they are moving towards Oman, I think, correct me Malcolm if I'm wrong. I know in Oman it was 70-30 the past couple of years, and Mr. Panel also told me this information earlier this morning. So hopefully they will go to full 100% in the mainland. But there is still one hurdle is the exemption. Go.
Okay, I think the common theme is that all the jurisdictions are very hungry for foreign investment. They've made some meaningful reforms that will make it more attractive to come into their jurisdictions. And this is a time of competition and proactive planning by the governments and sometimes efficiencies in terms of issuing new laws. So I think this is a good moment before we move on to our next major theme, which is the regulatory regimes, to invite questions. Let's take 2 questions right now, make them short, and we'll make our answers quick, and we'll quickly get on to the second theme. Who's first? If there are any, maybe we've been so comprehensive and informative that you know everything you want to know. Let's see, who shall I recruit? Michael, do you have any thoughts or questions for us?
Thanks, Chris. I know that each country has certain areas in which foreign investment is restricted. And I'm just wondering, does it seem likely that at any point those areas will eventually open up to foreign investment? Because some of them are very lucrative sectors, and they are primarily protected right now due to national interests or various other issues. But I'm just wondering, do you see that changing at some point? I mean, I know that the places like Saudi are opening up some. Qatar certainly has. I think a lot of the other countries in the region are trying to do their best to do that. So I'm just wondering if you ever see it actually becoming, for lack of a better term, a free market.
That's a hugely topical issue, Michael. And in Saudi Arabia, the big prize has been oil and gas. And there is a new petroleum law that just came out. And like elsewhere, the actual royal decrees and the laws are very vague and they defer to regulation. We don't have regulations yet. But what they do say is that concessions will be available to foreign investors. And so if that's true, I think it makes a lot of sense, because the whole spirit of Vision 2030 is to rely on the private sector and on companies with the expertise and the finance to come in and develop the expensive new areas, whether it be oil and gas or minerals. But I suspect from what I hear that they are opening up in that critical sector. And so that will be monumental because not only does Saudi Arabia have the richest oil and gas reserves in the world, it also has among the most attractive mineral resources that are largely untapped and that are hugely compelling for the mining companies of Australia and elsewhere. And by and large, the message from on top is that they really would like to have a lot more serious foreign investments. So that's critical to achieving the goals of Vision 2030, to diversify the economy with the help of companies from abroad who know how to do this in sectors that are novel in our country. But let's see, Charles, why don't you have a bite at that apple?
Sure. Yeah, it's the list of restricted activities could be changed by cabinet resolution. So in terms of the procedures that are required, there's flexibility built in. Do I think they're going to change the list? Well, oil and gas. I'll start with, there's a bunch of topics that perhaps are a bit sticky, okay? One is oil and gas, one is defense, and there are a couple of others, like carbon agencies and things like that. Let me start with oil and gas. Oil and gas is an emirate topic, not a federal topic. Again, the UAE is kind of unusual. So, and as probably all of you know, the vast majority of the UAE's hydrocarbon resources are in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. There's a little bit in Dubai, a little bit in Sharjah. The other emirates have a small trickle of either gas or oil or something. Even the fracturing stuff, that's all supposed to be in Abu Dhabi. There's a formation on the border with Dubai where they haven't begun exploiting it yet anyway. So the only game in town virtually is Abu Dhabi. And the rule there is that anyone can go and set up an oil field services company. If you want to do drilling, if you want to do pipeline, foreign companies are already there. Concessions, probably not. And what we've got right now is that the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, concessions are given to foreign oil producers. And unlike before in the old days, it was only American, French, Japanese, and British oil companies. Now it's a whole bunch of others from like Thailand and China and I think Korea. So it's everyone is getting into the game in terms of owning a share in the oil fields. But that concession doesn't mean you operate the field. It just means you're one of the concession holders. And it's a different system from before. ADNOC itself, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, via its subsidiary, handles all the operations. And again, the concession holders get a percentage of the royalties and other fiscal payments that are paid to them. And that's not going to change, to be real. Abu Dhabi quite deliberately took control of the concessions. They were originally given entirely to the Iraq Petroleum Company, which was BP, in 1949, quite a long time ago. Those concessions expired during the previous decade, and Abu Dhabi's aren't going to go back to that old system of having foreign concession holders with that much of a role in Abu Dhabi. It's called the National Oil Company for a reason. It's really under the control of the government. No one's unhappy with it. No one's saying, "Oh, please change the system." No, it's working. And when special technology is required to exploit a difficult formation, they can tender for that. And the oil majors are happy to come in. And good examples of that recently, Shell transformed the oil sector in Abu Dhabi with its sour gas. They found a way to make marketable product out of sour gas, which had been a problem before. And now the sulfur is being sent overseas. It also gave birth to the Etihad rail system to bring the stuff to the coast, to the petroleum ports. Exxon's working on getting the Upper Zakum field, notoriously difficult to produce, more efficient. Abu Dhabi wants to become a swing producer. It won't get 11 million barrels a day like our friends over here in the kingdom, but it's aiming for 4.5. And it probably will get there in the next 10 years. So, and that'll be enough to make it have some kind of impact on the world price. So Abu Dhabi, UAE's oil and gas sector isn't going to be open, at least in terms of the production, to foreign direct shareholders. It'll be, the concessions are going to be agreed as and when. But of course, oil field services, it's open. It always has been.
So the general theme, I think this applies also to Oman and Qatar, that the doors are opening, albeit in some cases slowly and fitfully. And I want to move right on to another question, but give me just one sentence from each country about whether your experience aligns with Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Thanks, Chris. If I may, just 2 sentences. But yes, hydrocarbons, defence, I think will take, they are still difficult sectors, restricted. But I think what we're seeing is areas such as minerals in Oman, and also alternative energy, green hydrogen, solar. Those are being opened up to investment and much needed new technology from outside.
Okay, 2 sentences for Qatar.
So in Qatar, I don't think there's been an opening up of the oil and gas sector to more foreign investment, really. What we've seen over the last decade or so is that Qatar Energy itself has sort of set up its own opcos to operate its own oil fields. And there's been a clawback, as a matter of fact, in Qatar from what we've seen in the last few years by the state oil and gas player to take back interest in the oil and gas fields. And there's been a number of international oil and gas companies that are actually backing up.
Well, when you're such a dominant player, it's hard to resist using your muscle.
And also, in addition to oil and gas and defense, which Qatar aligns with other GCC countries, there are 2 on the negative list, 2 of activities or sectors that came across my mind, which are the manpower, energy, and contracting. So these 2 are still on the negative list, and everything else is on the positive list. So long there is a sponsorship regime in Qatar, the manpower activity will stay on the negative list. This is my view. And with respect to contracting, it is because of the huge event that happened in 2022, which is the World Cup. I believe that's why the ministry or the government is not leaning to open this activity for foreign investors, 100%, of course.
Well, that was such a good question, Michael, that I think it took a lot of energy. So I think we'll keep the questions at 1 and we'll move on to our next major topic. Oh, a quick one though, because we don't want to miss our mark in covering all 3 issues.
In the matter of taxation, how you compare GCC countries?
How do I see taxation? The taxation is the biggest challenge for foreign investors in Saudi Arabia because of the discrepant treatment between the foreign investor and the Saudi investor. The foreign investor pays a 20% corporate income tax. The Saudi investor pays zakat, which ends up being much lower. So that's a big source of contention that the US government has been pressing in the TIFA, Trade and Investment Framework Agreement negotiations to try to equalize tax treatment. There has been a radical increase in the value-added tax from 5% to 15%, which is an equal tax as between foreign investors and Saudis. So in a sense, it's more fair, but it's also very onerous. So that's been quite heavy. And there's been some speculation that it may be knocked back down to 5% to improve the investment attractiveness. Any big high note tax issues in
when it comes to Qatar, in brief, it's in line with Saudi, so Qatari nationals are exempted from paying tax. However, there is an obligation to file tax returns and declare their statements to the General Tax Authority. The foreigners are subject to 10% income tax, depending on which jurisdiction the entity is incorporated. So if it's in the mainland, with the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, they are subject to 10%. If it is in the Qatar Financial Center, QFC, it's also subject to 10% income tax. When it comes to Qatar Free Zone Authority, for example, they are entitled to 20 years tax holiday. So this is very interesting. But Qatar Free Zone Authority, it's also controversial whether or not it's an onshore, offshore, whether an entity in the Qatar Free Zone can carry out business in mainland Qatar or only for outside Qatar. So this is also not clear and vague in the QFZ regulations. Other than that, from a tax perspective, we see VAT is coming, but till now, it's not implemented in Qatar. So there's no VAT in Qatar, no personal income tax in Qatar. There is 5% withholding tax for any services carried out in Qatar, on royalties, interest, etc., for entities outside Qatar that do not have or consider to have by the General Tax Authority a permanent establishment in Qatar. Otherwise, then they will be subject to the 10% income tax.
Good.
If I may, I think what the conclusion that we can draw from that seems to be that Qatar, amongst the GCC countries, comes out more favorably on a comparative basis or from a tax perspective, in that, firstly, for example, there's no VAT. And there are these free zones where you have a 20-year tax holiday. These options to avoid, for tax avoidance, that Qatar presents. So I think in that respect, in these two respects, Qatar comes out most favorably. Well, as Ribal said, there are, however, certain restrictions on what you can do when you set up in the free zones. But for example, can fintechs provide their IT products from within the free zone into the mainland or elsewhere? That's a bit debatable. Our experience has been that for fintechs, what is permitted is consulting services. But invariably, the consultation that information technology companies will provide will be in the form of electronic communications. They are able to, and it is a tolerated practice for them to be able to also provide certain apps and softwares from within the free zones, although it's debatable whether someone in the free zone, a fintech or other IT company, should be permitted as per their license to actually sell products. But because they're not tangible products, it is tolerated for them to provide also apps by way of consulting or consultation.
Thank God for loopholes. Michael, what's our time limit? I know we've extended. We were originally for 11:50. Do we have a little more time than that?
I think we can probably eat up the remaining 10 minutes and then go straight into lunch, and then we'll start topic 3 straight up at 2 o'clock.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes. We're going to move quickly through regulatory regime and governance. So regulatory regime. This is a relatively new phenomenon in Saudi Arabia. With WTO in 2006, we found new regulations for competition in the capital market. We had the capital market authority set up, food and drug. There's a whole range of regulatory regimes that you find in the rest of the world that are now catching up in Saudi Arabia, but it's recent enough that it's still a work in progress. And sometimes there's the danger of overreach. And so, for example, the competition authority has such low thresholds that when big multinationals seek to engage in cross-border mergers, not only do you have to worry about the US and the EU, now Saudi Arabia has elevated itself to the same level, even with quite insignificant impact in the local market. And so that's one area where there's some conflict between Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world. And often you find that there's a misalignment of regulations between the different ministries. And so the Ministry of Investment is charged with bringing in foreign investments, and the Ministry of Human Resources is charged with sending the expats home and replacing them with Saudis. And so we have quotas of 95% in the banking industry and 75% in the legal profession that are unattainable by foreign investors and end up excluding any competition from the multinational firms. What is the experience in the UAE in terms of regulations? Do you have the same conflict between regulators, and are they more sort of sympathetic to concerns about efficiency on a global marketing basis?
It's similar. It's not the UAE regulatory approach is everything is regulated. There's much more. It used to be the case that there were areas of activity in the market that were not subject to any formal regulation. That's probably no longer true. There might be one or two I'm just not able to think of right now. But basically, there are statutes or regulations on most of what is being done in the world. The two themes are, I would say that business usually is about 20 years ahead of law. So the regulations are always playing catch up. We're always trying to fix the problems of 20 years ago, so we're dealing with the problems of 2005 right now in the legislation. I mean, maybe not blockchain, but a lot of other things are the law is playing catch up. But generally, the UAE is trying to be pro-business, trying to be have a light touch in regulation. When there are issues, the regulations get tweaked. We're facing issues right now with data privacy because of the conflicting rules in the free zones, outside the free zones, with the United States and Europe, and so if you've got a multinational workforce, you've got multinational demands on your on how you treat personal data, for example, and that's going on. It's just part of the background. But overall, I'd say the UAE is a fairly mature regulatory environment now, trying to keep the light touch, not over-regulate industry and over-regulate business too much. But under-regulation can be bad too, as we are going to get into this, but recent financial scandals have shown. So it's onward and upward, I guess.
Malcolm?
Thanks, Chris. I think if I was looking at the Oman regulatory environment, it's probably good in parts. Certainly, Oman joined the WTO in 2000 and it's been progressing. Where I think things are moving forward, we have what was the Capital Markets Authority, now the Financial Services Authority, working quite closely with the Central Bank of Oman on various regulatory matters. We're advising the government on the new virtual asset regulations and virtual asset service provider regulations. So we'll have a cryptocurrency regime, hopefully in the not too distant future. I think there is a bit of a tension between the grey area between the CBO and the FSA, where one authority stops and the other starts. But overall, I think we're making progress there. Again, as Charles said, the data protection field is quite tricky. We're due to implement a set of data protection regulations next month. It's been put back by a year. We've got issues around hosting data outside the Sultanate. That's quite a tricky area for us. On the competition side, regulatory competition side, we do have a regulator that's starting to take interest in transactions, but I think it's probably fair to say that we're sometimes struggling to understand their rationale behind what they're doing. So I think that's the internal regulation. The other thing that we've noticed is external regulation, which would be for us at the moment FATF, Financial Action Task Force, and Oman's just gone through an inspection by FATF, and fortunately it's come out without too many needs to change. But certainly that's an area, particularly if you're looking at something like cryptocurrency, it's quite a tricky area. So I think you ought to consider the external regulation as well as internal regulations. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We've got only 5 minutes, so I'm going to invite one of you to decide between yourselves to speak very briefly to the regulatory environment in Qatar, and then we're going to move on to governance, and that'll be our last topic.
So, with the recent developments regarding to regulatory laws in Qatar, I can speak about the cryptocurrency, virtual assets issue. So, back in 2018, the Qatar Central Bank, which is the regulatory authority of all financial institutions and banks in Qatar, issued a circular to these entities prohibiting them to deal in any sort of virtual assets transactions, or even allow bank account holders to buy or sell or be involved, whether directly or indirectly, in these transactions. In 2020, so after 2 years later, it issued another circular stipulating that due to the growth of dealing with cryptocurrency and virtual assets, it has come to their attention that on social media, especially many financial institutions are promoting that they assist individuals or provide the provision or services of virtual dealing in virtual assets. So it issued a warning, and it mentioned that it is strictly prohibited under the Qatar Central Bank law, which is 12 of 2013, and the AML CFT law, anti-money laundering law. And any bank that will facilitate any transaction or even receive monies resulting from these sorts of transactions will be penalized and sanctioned. From a data privacy perspective, just to add on Malcolm, actually we have seen a very good development for the regulatory regime of data privacy. In fact, a National Cybersecurity Agency was created back in 2020. It created an affiliate, which is the National Data Protection Office. Recent developments, unofficial yet, is that the data protection law will be amended, whereby the cross-border data flow will be more restricted, because currently it's open. Now it will be more restricted, and there will be an obligation on data controllers. The data controllers are the ones who determines the purpose of processing personal data, to appoint a data protection officer or a champion or what have you. So these are in line with the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the EU regulation mainly. But other than that, I think this is, it's an attractive environment, regulatory environment. It regulates everything: consumer protection, e-commerce, commercial agency, etc.
Thanks very much. I think we've used up my 5 minutes, so I think that corporate governance is going to be overlooked, which I think is not entirely inaccurate for the picture of corporate governance in the region, but hopefully it's a work in progress and it will improve. In terms of cryptocurrencies, Warren Buffett called them financial weapons of mass destruction. They were heavily controlled and regulated in the U.S. I think Ross Ulbricht, who launched Silk Road, did 10 years in prison because his cryptocurrency online service facilitated drug trade. But now in the new administration, Donald Trump is more favorable. He's given a pardon to Ross Ulbricht. Possibly that may be a new age for cryptocurrency, but it does have lots of risks. So governments are being very cautious. And so Michael, have I used up my time? And should we call it a wrap at this point? Sure. Okay, well, thank you for your interest and your patience. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but we're all around and you know where to find us. So thank you all very much.